Good afternoon. My name is John Smith. I teach here at UCI in the Department of European Languages and Studies. I'm very pleased to be able to introduce this third Wellek Library lecture by our distinguished visitor, Catherine Malabou. Now, given that we are approaching the end of the academic year and that this has already been a long and theory-filled day, I'm tempted to be lazy and simply repeat the introduction that I gave for Catherine back in 2002 when she first came to Irvine for a lecture. Gabi referred to this last time. Back then, I began with the following remarks. There are a good many reasons for pursuing intellectual or academic interests: to learn, to teach what one has learned, perhaps even to discover the truth. But there is an additional reason, perhaps the most important, which we often don't admit to ourselves. Namely, we, at least I, pursue intellectual and academic interests in order to encounter kindred spirits, to meet in writing or in person people and ideas who spark in me a Nietzschean affirmation. My encounter with the writings and now the person of Catherine Malabou has been such an experience for me. That's what I said in 2002, and the sentiments hold true, or even truer today. However, it's not enough to repeat comments from the past. My task today is not just to honor my friend, but also to indicate where she has taken us so far in the first two lectures, especially for those of you who are just joining this broadcast. Briefly, all too briefly, I would say that on Wednesday we were introduced to two front lines in a battle. She chose the military metaphor, intentionally, over how to think about thinking. On the one side, she sketched the history of a concept of intelligence that is the domain of psychologists and behavioral geneticists. They have attempted to come up with models to quantify this quasi-preformed phenomenon in us, determinately connected perhaps to our genetic makeup. On the other side are the philosophers, who have thrown up protective shields to guard a creative, immeasurable, non-programmable intellect. Here she has listed a variety of contemporary thinkers who stand in a turtle formation, closing themselves off even as they protect their object. She mentioned Deleuze, Derrida, Agamben, Foucault, and even an earlier Catherine Malabou. Many of us likely find ourselves in this camp. The trajectory of her talks is that this paradigm is untenable and, in fact, has already undergone a shift. She argued yesterday that the genetic paradigm has given way to the epigenetic one, where the brain's responses to the outside world introduce fundamental transformations that fall under the term neuroplasticity. Furthermore, even this paradigm needs to be rethought, a major undertaking for Malabou, the philosopher of plasticity. Because in the world of artificial intelligence, even plasticity is programmable. And here I would just interject in good Hegelian fashion that she needn't despair that her key concept was developed in vain, because if programs have become plastic, then it's not just that plasticity is under attack. Programming itself, what it is to be a program, is itself being transformed and made plastic. But her broad point is that philosophy, therefore, cannot wall its notion of the intellect off from the historical and structural force of intelligence. And psychology and the biosciences cannot maintain a strictly causal and mechanical interpretation. Rather, we need a more dialectical approach. I love this. But let me contextualize Catherine Malabou's significance for us in a new way that connects it to the other topic of these 2 days here, namely theory. And here a shout out to my theory students. Although not a strong follower of Adorno, I would like to cite a passage from him on theory, because I think it would capture something important about Catherine Malabou's mode of thinking, and also it connects us to kritische Theorie, which is, as Gabi pointed out, another aspect of our project. Referring critically to Nietzsche and a certain kind of self-absorption all too common amongst us, Adorno states in the introduction to Negative Dialectics that, quote, ideology lies in wait for the mind which delights in itself, the mind which all but irresistibly becomes an absolute to itself. And then he goes on, theory prevents this. It corrects the naive self-confidence of the mind without obliging it to sacrifice its spontaneity, at which theory aims in turn. I suppose I would add theory at its best accomplishes this combination of disciplined self-criticism and spontaneity, since unfortunately much that passes itself off for theory is all too irresistibly pleased with itself and thus ripe for ideology. My point is that this notion of theory captures the spirit of Catherine Malabou's thought, which both reins in the self-confidence of the mind with dialectical rigor and follows it and allows it further spontaneity and metamorphosis. Her work is aptly captured by Adorno's continuation, quote, "Theory and mental experience need to be in a reciprocal relationship. Theory does not contain answers to everything. It reacts to the world which is faulty to the core. Mobility," that's my emphasis, mobility is of the essence of consciousness. It is no accidental feature. It means a doubled mode of conduct, an inner one, the immanent process which is the properly dialectical one, and a free, unbound one like stepping out of dialectics. I think we have already seen an exemplification of such theory in action over the past two Wellek lectures, and this in two ways. On the one hand, Catherine Malabou's way of thinking and philosophical approach is motivated by an interaction between theory and experience. She reacts to the faulty world, in this case, the burgeoning world of quantitative psychology and neuro and bioscience, and the failure of philosophy to intervene in it. On the other hand, at the level of content, her response to this world is a revitalized, and I choose that metaphor of life consciously, a revitalized concept of intelligence. That, we could say with Adorno, embraces mobility as an essential feature. To connect it to her earlier work, we could call it the plasticity of thinking. I suspect this is the role that Jackson Pollock will play in the lecture we are about to hear. I'm excited to hear more of Catherine Malabou's theory, the mobility and plasticity of her thought, her dialectics, and stepping out of dialectics. Please join me in welcoming Catherine Malabou for her lecture, Like a Pollock Painting.
If I could use my own language, French, for a change, I think I would find the words to tell you also how important you are to me, John, and so how some of you have become so important to me as well. People I met during this visit. Again, thank you so much, George, for having made it possible. Thank you to my students, and thank you to my new friends, and thank you all for coming. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for listening to me for so long, etc. So yes, I was desperate. Well, I was doubtful and desperate about plasticity, about my own work. But I think that self-critique is also an essential dimension of thinking. I remember that from Lyotard as well. Said everything has to be put to the test of self-critique, otherwise it's not worth. And I quite agree with that. And again, to go back to Hegel, skepticism is as close as possible to dialectics. So I think that moment of self-critique was necessary. But of course now, I want to go further. And for that, I'm hearing Bourdieu's voice. How could you be so naive? It says, what is currently happening with AI is just a new form of an old political problem. What is very naive, Catherine, is to think that the expositions defined yesterday as the plastic conditions for intelligence are only and univocally the doors to freedom and enlightenment. As bodily inscriptions of the social, they are also what get most controlled, normalized, and manipulated. Plasticity, you should have known that right from the beginning, always finds itself plasticized, plagiarized, reified by what Bourdieu call the political order. Pascal already knew long before the blue brain that the habitus also implied the transformation of our dispositions into automatisms, into these depersonalized mechanisms the political order can, I quote Bourdieu, trigger like springs. The political order always already achieves, in one way or another, the metamorphosis of natural dispositions into a kind of artificial intelligence. I quote from Bourdieu again, cognitive structures are not forms of consciousness, but dispositions of the body, practical schemes. Therefore, he goes on, the state does not need to give orders or to be physically coercive to produce a well-regulated social world. As long as it is able to produce cognitive structures that are in agreement with objective structures, it can be certain of the subject's submission to the established norms. In other words, I should have known right from the beginning that plasticity is necessarily and irreducibly ambiguous. On the one hand, it helps determine intelligence as openness to the other, ontological indeterminacy and freedom. But on the other hand, it forms the basis of social mechanisms of obedience, subjection, and as Ray Terada was saying yesterday, of passivity. Let's think of the formula available brain time, used in management, advertisement, TV programming, and in pedagogy even. Plasticity can, of course, be reduced to a certain amount of available brain time. The general concept of brain availability currently appears, from the point of view of the political order, as the best possible definition of intelligence, as a new form of G factor, determining thresholds of attention, concentration, and responsiveness. And whether this availability is innate or culturally produced is of no importance. Again, the current capture of plasticity by artificial intelligence is nothing new in its principle. And Pascal, again, had very well understood that in his time, long before the digital era. He said that the automaton was the inevitable reversed image of spirit, that no spirit can exist independently from its mechanical doubling. This forces to re-envisage the possible strategies of resistance to such a capture, which is definitely inevitable. Going back to my tortoise, I do think, and I reaffirm it, that a strategy of opposition, face-to-face, neurocybernetics on the one hand, critique of biopolitics on the other, is of absolutely no help. Critiques of technoscience and biopower, deconstructions of sovereignty, denunciations of instrumentalization of life in particular, produced by biopolitical and cybernetic modes of control, lack actuality as long as they rely on a strict separation between the symbolic and the biological, and think of critique as a possible outside whatever its form of the system. I've tried to demonstrate this in the class I taught here. And at the same time, I now realize that the strategy developed in my book, What Should We Do with Our Brain, was itself participating in its own way in this confidence in the outside. Because again, I believed that neural plasticity, which I discovered and studied with such curiosity, such excitement, passion even, was the undeniable proof of the irreducibility of the brain to a machine, and consequently also of intelligence to a flexible software program. Once again, now I understand how naive a position was, and I'm ready to move further. If natural and artificial intelligence are two sides of the same reality, if natural intelligence is always already artificial, and if artificial intelligence is always already plastic, then there is no point in trying to dissociate them. The problem is then to know if any space is left for a critical approach of such a unity within that unity itself. If we relinquish any idea of frontal conflict, as well as the self-critique, the strategy of the self-critique, with its weight of guilt, we can perhaps explore another possibility, and this is what I will do now, which consists in developing what I will call internal logics of interruptions. That is, provoke a series of ruptures or suspensions from within the system. Interruptions that do not block the system, but on the contrary, allow for its dialectical future or opening. Last year in April, so 2014, My colleague and friend David Bates from the Rhetoric Department at Berkeley organized a workshop on plasticity and pathology, and I also participated in that workshop. And David gave a presentation called Automaticity and Plasticity, an alternative history of artificial intelligence. And he developed the very interesting concept of a critical approach to automaticity. So he allowed me to quote his presentation, which will soon come out as an article. He says, once plasticity has been fully integrated into the computational and neurophysiological model of the brain, resistance to the total automatization of the human thinking cannot rely on romanticized concepts of selfhood or philosophical critique of materialism. It seems to me that we, on the contrary, must focus on the foundations of the digital brain. Resistance can be generated, that is, through a critical history of automaticity. And this critical history consists in bringing to light the fundamental duality, or the ambiguity rather, that form the very heart of the concepts of automatism and automaticity. What ambiguity? At the same time that some cyberneticians, in the beginning artificial intelligence, at the same time that some cyberneticians were claiming that the brain was just an automatic calculator like the computer, crucial figures in the history of computing immediately recognized the importance of the radical plasticity of the brain for the project of artificial intelligence. The plastic brain, it was thought, right from the beginning, offered the possibility of modeling creative, unpredictable leaps of human intelligence, capacities that went well beyond the relentlessly automatic performance of rigid functional mechanisms or habitual behaviors. Right from the start, automatism was ambiguous because there were two options at the beginning of artificial intelligence. The first one was the cybercapture of natural plasticity, understood as a pure and simple assimilation, quantification, and augmentation of natural intelligence by the machine. Since the brain is already a computer, since plasticity is already automatic, it is just a matter of replicating them in increasing their efficiency. And I think that for most people, this is what artificial intelligence is. But there was, and there is, a second possibility, according to which natural plasticity is seen, first of all, as the capacity to dismantle its own automaticity and routine. That is, as both the capacity to fail, and I totally agree with Akbar on that point, the capacity to fail, be impaired, damaged, and get over it. As we know, plasticity also characterizes the capacity to compensate after a wound or a trauma. Scarring, regeneration, regrowth are important plastic capacities of all organisms. This is exactly what the most important and interesting cyberneticians have tried and are still trying to conceive: a machine able to interrupt itself as such, to go in a certain sense, and for that reason, beyond itself, and to repair itself. That's why the central concepts for them became interruption and reorganization rather than just simulation or appropriation. And all the interesting people in artificial intelligence, Ashbey, I will quote him in a moment, Minsky, and even Turing himself, all these people belong to that trend and not to the first one. While other cyberneticians were just working at elaborating machines, Ross Ashbey, the great British psychiatrist and pioneer in artificial intelligence, sought right from the start to conceptualize a machine that had, like the nervous system, what William James had called an incalculable element that could interrupt productively the machine's own fatalistic operation. Ashbey made a conceptual breakthrough by thinking about the potential value of failure that was, after all, inevitable in any working machine. Ashbey realized that when a machine broke, it became, in essence, a brand new machine with a new design, so to speak. In an article called The Nervous System as Physical Machine, he declared, "A break is a change in organization." I quote David Bates again, "Our digital brains, brain modeled on and simulated by computers, and even, to a large extent, formed by repeated interactions with our digital prostheses, will reveal their genuine plasticity only when they rediscover the power of interrupting their own automaticity." So what is interesting is that, in fact, it is the machine that today are teaching us to not behave like automata. Following this, well, I go back to the movie Ex Machina in a moment. This is the topic of the movie. Following this perspective, we reach a point where natural and artificial intelligence share a common definition, which is the capacity to fail and to reinvent themselves out of this failure or these obstacles or blanks. I will give some example of this identity of definition. Natural intelligence first. To go back to Piaget. So as I said yesterday, Piaget was employed at the Binet Institute in the 20s, where his job was to develop French versions of questions of English intelligence tests. As I said also yesterday, he became intrigued with the reasons children gave for their wrong answers on the question of logic. He came to the conclusion that the development of intelligence is not a gradual increase in number, but is made of discrete stages marked by great gradual differences according to a movement of assimilation and accommodation, he says. Between the different stages, there are blanks, what he calls blanks, that is, interruptions, when the child's intelligence is like suspended. But these gaps are fundamental as they constitute the epigenesis of intelligence. So failure is inherent, is immanent to intelligence. This idea was also present in another French psychologist, Claparède. I quote from an article, well, this is my own translation. "Ruptures of balance, when reflexes or habits are not prepared to intervene, do not automatically go back to normal, and we are momentaneously disadapted. It is the task of intelligence to provide us with means of readaptation." I think this is really beautiful, that intelligence is what helps us to readapt ourselves after a failure. These definitions that include failure within intelligence are also very important, as I said, in artificial intelligence. I will take two examples here also. The great philosopher of technology, Gilbert Simondon. First of all, I quote from Simondon. "The real development of machines, of which one can say that they have a high degree of technicity, corresponds not to an increase in automatism, but rather to the fact that the operation of a machine contains a certain margin of indetermination and failure. It is this margin that allows a machine to be sensitive to external information. And it is by this sensitivity to information that a technical unit can be carried out much more than by an increase of automatism. A purely automatic machine that is completely closed on itself in a predetermined operation can give only summary results. Alternatively, a machine with a high level of technicity is an open system, and all open machines suppose the human as a permanent organizer, which can be interpreted as the living machine, so to speak, that organizes one against the other. The last example I will take of that, about that idea is precisely the Pollock painting, the sequence in the movie Ex Machina. And thank you to Jane and John for taking me to that movie. So to me, the most interesting moment of this film is when Nathan, who is that eccentric genius who creates artificially intelligent creatures, and Caleb, who's a young computer programmer, have a discussion in front of a Pollock painting in Nathan's living room. And they have a discussion about automatism. So they have a discussion about automatism. And Caleb asks, what is automatism and what is artificial intelligence? And Nathan says, look at that painting. To me, Pollock's painting is automatic art. And he says because it is not deliberate, not random, but someplace in between. And I think this is very strong, that a true automatism is somewhere in between necessity and contingency, just like the way in which Pollock is painting. And in a suppressed scene of the movie, we learn, in fact, that the Pollock they're looking at is a fake recreated by a computer. According to these definitions of automaticity and automatism as intermediaries between necessity and contingency, we can conceive of an interaction between brains and machines that will rely on their reciprocal capacities to create catastrophes, breaks, failures in each other, thus mutually challenging their capacity to reorganize themselves and delineate new thresholds of regulations as a response to these ruptures, engaging themselves, in other terms, in a dialectic between mechanism and autonomy. This dialectic might be seen as the dynamic of resolution of the internal conflict mentioned in my second lecture between intelligence and itself, between the shield and the obstacle, that is, between the two meanings of the Greek problema. In order to bring this lecture, as well as my general trajectory to a close, I would like to propose a reflection on the way in which this blurring of frontiers between the inside and the outside, the natural and the artificial, lead us to think differently about disciplinary borders, and particularly those between the humanities and neuroscience. Among the many transformations that are currently occurring in the domain of education, and of higher education in particular, two major ones are, first of all, the emergence and proliferation of neurodisciplines, neurolinguistics, neuroeconomics, neuroanthropology, neuroliterature, to name a few. And second, the generalization and increasing of open and distance learning. Without trying to propose any reconciliation proper between intellect and the intelligence, or between the elements of the strategic tortoise, critique of biopolitics, deconstruction of sovereignty mainly, and the new aspects of the epigenetic approaches to the brain and to technology, I would nevertheless like to show how a dialogue between these different positions is both possible and necessary, again, based on the logic or logics of interruptions I just mentioned. So the first problem, the neurodisciplines and the humanities. How can we think of a neuroplasticity of the humanities that would bring some plasticity to the humanities, as well as some critical theory to neurobiology? This is also one of my problems. In What is Enlightenment? Foucault reminds us that critique, which is for him indissociable from the humanities, is, in its Kantian sense, a discourse on limits and frontiers. Criticism, Foucault says, I quote, consists of analyzing and reflecting upon limits. Further, we have to move beyond the inside-outside alternative. We have to be at the frontiers. We find exactly the same idea in Derrida's University without condition. I quote from Derrida. One touches the very limits between the inside and the outside. One thinks in the humanities the irreducibility of their outside and of their future. One thinks in the humanities that one cannot and must not let oneself be enclosed within the inside of the humanities. But for this thinking to be strong and consistent requires the humanities. On this border, Derrida pursues, the university must therefore negotiate and organize its resistance. Our question today is, how can we negotiate with this specific outside of the humanities that neurohumanities represent? The very term neurohumanities, which is more and more often used, speaks from outside neuro and inside, at the same time, humanities. So how is it possible to remain on this limit between the humanities and the neurobiological? Because the situation has changed since Derrida's University without condition. At the time when he wrote, Derrida affirmed that, I quote again, the new concept of the humanities should include law, legal studies, as well as what is called in this country, the US of course, where this formation originated, theory, an original articulation of literary theory, translation theory, philosophy, linguistics, anthropology, psychoanalysis, and so forth. Okay, but right now, in the present time, what the new concept of the humanities should include is their neurologization, that is, a biologization of the symbolic or of the transcendental. But the problem is, how is it possible to biologize the transcendental without destroying it purely and simply, and without, again, reducing the intellect to the formlessness of intelligence? In What is Enlightenment, Foucault already proposes a reflection on the transcendental. It is, according to me, the first reflection on the plasticity, the possible plasticity of the transcendental. We know that this text, What is Enlightenment, is an echo of Kant's 1784 own What is Enlightenment. In 1784, the German periodical Berlinische Monatsschrift invited its readers to submit answers to the question, what is enlightenment? In Kant's response, the only one actually published, he was the winner. What a surprise. Philosophical thought was made to reflect for the first time on its own present in the form of the following question. What difference does today introduce with respect to yesterday? And it is at this point that Kant introduces his concept of critique. Foucault shares Kant's answer on all points in What is Enlightenment, except one. He contests the idea of transcendental impassable limits. Foucault asks, what would be the adequate response today to the question, what is enlightenment, where it addressed again to us? What would we say? And Foucault has this very puzzling and difficult answer. Contrarily to what Kant said in his time, we have today to transgress the transcendental and to displace the limits. Criticism, he says, is no longer going to be practiced in the search for formal structures with universal values, but rather as a historical investigation into the events that have led us to constitute ourselves and to recognize ourselves as subjects of what we are doing, thinking, saying. And he has this sentence, the new criticism is not transcendental. In other terms, already in Foucault's time, we had to build a non-transcendental criticism. This formula may seem extremely shocking, but it nevertheless opened, according to Foucault, the field of a new ontology, I quote, a historical ontology of ourselves that must turn away from all projects that claim to be global or radical. The new criticism is not transcendental. Its goal, Foucault pursues, is not that of making a metaphysics possible. It is genealogical in its design and archaeological in its method. Archaeological and not transcendental in the sense that it will not seek to identify the universal structures of all possible moral actions, but will seek to treat the instances of discourse that articulate what we think, say, and do as so many historical events. And this critique will be genealogical in the sense that it will separate out from the contingency that has made us what we are, the possibility of no longer being, doing, or thinking what we are, do, or think. It is not seeking to make possible metaphysics that has finally become a science. It is seeking to give new impetus as far and wide as possible to the undefined work of freedom. If the humanities have to redesign their frontiers to engage with this internal outside or external inside that neuro-humanities are, then they have to take into account the part played by neural plasticity in the so-called critical ontology of ourselves. An ontology that, according to Foucault, has to take into account our ways of being and thinking. If we go back to Bourdieu's definition of intelligence as a set of plastic dispositions that are involved in habitus formation, then we can engage the dialogue between historical contingency, as Foucault defines it, and the epigenetic indeterminacy, as neurobiology characterizes it. Following Foucault's project, the critical ontology of ourselves should help us becoming aware of the way in which our plastic dispositions are at the same time always means of subjection, subjugation, and automatization. It should help us, in other terms, to discriminate, which is certainly not easy to do, between the deliberate and the random in our nature. That is, it should help us to become Pollock paintings and to produce the critique of this kind of making. I quote Foucault again: if the Kantian question of criticism was that of knowing what limits knowledge has to renounce transgressing, it seems to me that the critical question today has to be turned back into a positive one. In what is given to us as universal, necessary, obligatory, what place is occupied by whatever is singular, contingent, and the product of predetermined constraints? In other terms, what Foucault was already asking is, how can we interrupt our own automaticity? And the transcendental to come, the transcendental that is becoming plastic, is precisely the switch with which we can interrupt our own automatisms. To transgress the transcendental means to experiment it. Another very provocative statement by Foucault: the historical critical attitude must be an experimental one. Neurohumanities should then become the site for experimental theory, opening the path for diverse thoughts and techniques of self-transformation, inventions of the transcendental, and again, interruptions of automaticity. How can we do this concretely in the humanities? I will take one example. In a very interesting article called Literary Brains, Neuroscience, Criticism and Theory, published in April 2014 in Literary Compass, Patrick Cold-Hogan defines the so-called neurohumanities in those terms. The neurohumanities, he says, are largely traditional fields of humanistic study, prominently including literature and related arts, such as film, that have taken up findings or methods of neuroscience to advance their research. It is probably too early to undertake a survey of research in neuroscientific literary criticism and theory. However, there is considerable interest among literary scholars in the possibilities for such criticism and theory, And there are many areas of neuroscientific research that have begun to be incorporated into literary study or are likely to do so in the near future. This said, Colm-Hogan notices that the body of work in neurohumanities is limited because he says much of the work that has been done falls into the broad category of what we might call correlational criticism, which is often the initial phase of a new theoretical approach to literary analysis. So what does he call correlational criticism? It consists when a critique takes some neuroscientific concept and finds parallels for its elements and principles in literature. For example, I quote Hogan again, Proust's treatment of memory might be seen as anticipating that of some neuroscientists, as in Lehro's widely read book. You know, Proust was a neuroscientist. And this is certainly not interesting and not productive, he goes on, because the text becomes a pure pretext. And this is true. We can also mention in these attempts the attempt at applying synesthesia to literary criticism, what colors do you see when you read, or at explaining a work of art according to brain processing of visual information. Most of the time, everything that is done in the humanities is catastrophic. Because these attempts are all gestures of normalization. And we can refer here to some neurobiologists like Jean-Pierre Changeux, whom I quote yesterday, who, despite their remarkable and emancipating analysis of brain plasticity, affirm that our neural correlations are more sensitive to figurative rather than abstract art. There was a big conflict in Paris recently about the chair of contemporary music at the Collège de France. The current tenant of this chair, the pianist Carole Beffin, invited another pianist, Jérôme Dupin, to give a series of lectures. In one of them, called Atonal, do you say atonal music? Atonal music, so what? Already the title, atonal music, so what? Dupin criticized atonal music for the reason it would be decadent. After showing a video of Maurizio Pollini interpreting Klavierstück X by Stockhausen, he affirms that atonalism, which does not foster any logic of musical development, is not susceptible to awaken any kind of expectation in the spectator. According to him, listening to an atonal piece of music only produces a passive acceptance in which everything that is nothing can in reality happen. Pascal Dussapin, a prominent contemporary musician, has raised the polemic about this lecture. And there was, in the Collège de France, a very violent conflict. And among the different responses to this conflict were those of the neurobiologists who defended tonal music against atonal music, arguing that our neurons are more sensitive to it, and that our brain prefer. And you have the same kind of arguments regarding painting, art, etc. So this is why genuinely promising research in neurohumanities should go well beyond correlational criticism and well beyond that kind of normalization. Brain plasticity, and this is what the humanities could bring to the neurobiologists, we should explain to them that our brain is not predetermined in its structure, that it is free from any given framework, that our brain is not made for tonal music or figurative painting, that it is also open, once again, to ruptures of symmetry, ruptures of harmony, disadaptations, destabilizing works or forms, that is, again, to interruptions. Therefore, we can see how critical neurohumanities should therefore also tend to interrupt the automaticity of normalization, thus fostering new ways of reading, listening, and contemplating. So this was the first point, neurohumanities. And the second, open and distant learning. The traditional education system is based on the pattern of delivering knowledge on a teacher-student basis. Spanish sociologist Manuel Castells, on the contrary, predicts that the future of education lies in the combination of online distance learning and face-to-face learning. The operation will take place, I quote from his book, among computer nets, classrooms, and the place where each student is. This new cyberspace should allow new types of interactions between learners. Following Castells again, it is possible to affirm that, I quote, learners will apply a desirable course from an institution of another country due to particular factors of choice and can learn combining time and place, balancing work tasks, family responsibilities, and new opportunities to improve their knowledge level. Open and distance learning refers to the democratized access to learning with policies of open admissions, freedom to select what, when, and by which way to learn. End of quote. Many other sociologists or philosophers involved in research on distant learning, like Pierre Lévy in France, David Keegan and Holmberg in the UK, Peters in Germany, think that the challenge of the teacher-student educational model will also redefine the very notion of intelligence to the extent that it implies a variety of communicative modes essentially based on dialogue. And they precisely refer on that point, which takes us back to my first lecture, but in a different way, to Howard Gardner and his theory of multiple intelligences. Distance learning, sociologists and philosophers believe, will bring together different people and consequently also multiple intelligences or frames of mind as brought to light by Gardner. The model of a single type of intelligence, measurable through IQ tests or similar scales, is thus also put into question. Gardner himself shows great enthusiasm regarding the several windows of opportunity created by new digital tools. He emphasizes the use of emails, websites, video conferences, among other tools largely used in distance learning. He also takes into consideration the development of intelligent systems. He says that these systems are capable of modifying exercises as well as the pedagogical return based on previous success or failure. Current technologies seem tailor-made to help bring into reality the kind of multiple intelligences approach that I have endorsed, he says. According to another philosopher of cyberspace, Pierre Lévy, he's French, but I think he lives in Quebec now. The teacher will then become, as he says, the animator of a collective intelligence. The notion of collective intelligence, which is becoming more and more pregnant in pedagogy after being an important concept in sociobiology and political theory, involves a collective construction of knowledge, as well as a new sense of the community, of the we. Collective intelligence, according to Lévy, is, I quote, the synergy of skills, resources, and projects, the constitution and dynamic maintenance of shared memories, the activation of flexible and non-hierarchical modes of cooperation, the coordinated distribution of decision centers. I quote from the book called Collective Intelligence. Another quote, it is the enhancement, optimal use, and fusion of skill, imagination, and intellectual energy, regardless of their qualitative diversity. And this brings me back to the discussion we listened to this morning about some video conference, about digitalization, etc. Lévy suggests that rather than a dematerialization of information, or what Catherine Hales in How We Became Posthuman has in her elegant phrasing described as information losing its body, digitization must be seen as a new materiality, paradoxically. According to Lévy, the cyberspace is empty and yet full. It accepts all content, regardless of their quality. It is this that Levy identifies as cyberspace's most significant feature, a universality, he says, without any centralized meaning, this system of disorder and labyrinthine transparency. To go back to the issue of interruption, we can see it at work here in a very interesting way, according to me. First, virtualization here, though generated by and through the machines, infinitely surpasses computer technology to the extent that it urges its users to shape it. We have, in a way, to give a plastic form to the cyberspace. We have to fashion its contents, to sculpt them. And this is an example of how intelligence systems can be used as means to find alternative routes to traditional pedagogy. Artificial intelligence may then be regarded as a way to escape the rigidification of natural intelligence into a specific model, that of traditional pedagogy, to interrupt such a model. Again, we see how an automatism provides an escape route from another automatism. Intelligence versus intelligence, once again. To close on that point, it seems to me that these last developments are not incompatible with the conclusion of Derrida's university without condition again. Derrida, university must therefore negotiate and organize its resistance and take its responsibilities, not in order to enclose itself and reconstitute the abstract phantasm of sovereignty, but in order to resist effectively by allying itself with extra academic forces, in order to organize an inventive resistance through its oeuvre, its works, to all attempts at reappropriation, political, juridical, economic, and so forth, to all the other figures of sovereignty. This is another way of calling upon another topology. The university without conditions is not situated necessarily within the walls of what is today called the university. It is not necessarily exclusively exemplary, represented in the figure of the professor. It takes place, it seeks its place wherever this unconditionability can take shape. So already at the time, Derrida was calling for a type of distant learning. And if we refer again to Bourdieu, who you remember defined intelligence as conditionability, we can see with Derrida that conditionability also means unconditionability. And perhaps this new topology is something that intelligence and the intellect can share, something that philosophy and neurobiology can share, something that is not foreign to the critique of sovereignty, to the critique of biopolitics, and to the critique of police. Now I will conclude, because I think I talked too much already. I started these 3 lectures by saying that according to philosophers, intelligence was incapable to render the reason of its own origin. It comes either too early, such is the Kantian position, the affirmation of the a priori character of our faculties, or too late. The second position is that of Nietzsche, with whom I would like to conclude. Nietzsche is a great thinker of intelligence. Nietzsche strongly defends the idea that there can be no spirit, no thinking, no creative act without abilities, competition, selection, success, failure. But strangely for Nietzsche, intelligence always occurs after the fact. It is always a conclusion, never a starting point. In Ecce Homo, he declares, what is it, fundamentally, that allows us to recognize who has turned out well? Or in his language, which means who is intelligent, who is clever. But to recognize in the end who has turned out well, which means that genius can only be recognized a posteriori. This means, and this is something that Deleuze very profoundly understood, this means that for Nietzsche, selection should never occur according to pre-existing criteria. A genuine selection should produce its criteria as it takes place, that is always afterward. All predetermined tests, factors, catalogue of tasks, outline of jobs, protocol of exams, always precede the real encounter with the variability and diversity of candidates, thus preventing differences from emerging by themselves. Predefined selection or measurements end up only in the perpetuation of the criteria through which one chooses them. Most of the time, it is not the best that are selected, or even those that exhibit an astonishing capacity for adaptation. It is not the ones with the highest IQs who turn out well, but those who are the most conformable. And this is also something that Bourdieu knew perfectly. Agreement always takes precedence over value, ensuring the perpetuation and renewability of the identical. Social selection, for Nietzsche, ensures the return of sociological heaviness, never the emergence of singularities out of nothing. Again, testing and selection should therefore happen after the emergence of springing of a difference, in the same manner that variability precedes natural selection. Aristotle already knew it. It is always after he's dead that one can say who a man was. In between the two limits of the a priori and a posteriori that design the philosophical intellect's proper space, I have tried here to draw several passages, to study evolutions, to expose hazards as well as promises, to propose a reflection on the past and future of psychological, biological, and cybernetic intelligence, showing that the questions of cognitive and mental abilities, adaptive capacities, heritability cannot be separated from philosophical reflection. Intellect and intelligence, in the end, both refer, after all, to the same logos. Logos? In Cunning Intelligence, La Métisse des Grecs, d'Étienne and Vernon, and I would pay tribute to the memory of Jean-Pierre Vernon, who attended the controversy. D'Étienne and Vernon remind us of a certain type of intelligence, which in Greek is called métis. That means cunning intelligence, and was present in early Greece before it was supplanted with Plato, essentially, by the philosophical logos. Métis, as Vernon and D'Étienne argue, is the forgotten ancestor of logos. It is the type of intelligence required in navigation, in hunting, in medicine even, a type of intelligence, I quote from Vernon, that combines flair, wisdom, forethought, subtlety of mind, deception, resourcefulness, vigilance, opportunities, various skills and experiences acquired over the years. Shared by humans and animals, it is transient, shifting, and operates, I quote again, in ambiguous situations which do not lend themselves to precise measurement, exact calculation, and rigorous logic. The fox and the squid are its two favorite emblems. And the snake and the eagle for Nietzsche, I think, are also pertaining to that zoology. And its four major characteristics are the capacity to turn the game around the enemy, to wait for the right moments, to develop multicolored and multi-shaped types of shifting, the aptitude to duplicity and deceits, and the capacity to hide behind masks and illusion. In German, Métis has been translated as Klugheit, and in fact, I am sure that it is to Métis that Nietzsche refers, much more than to logos, to that Klugheit, which, in between and beyond intellect and the intelligence, leads him to ask in Ecce Homo this both comic but extremely profound question, Warum ich so klug bin? Why am I so clever? Thank you.